just thrilled to have students of Daniel. I think everybody recognizes sort of what a magnificent, how he can take very complicated material and make it accessible to all of us. And so it's a great privilege that we have him with us for this this particular mini course. He'll be with us throughout the year. And Daniel, I'm turning this over to you.
Thank you so much. Well, it's great to see everybody again. I'm glad that you all came back. So I guess the ideas of week one were not too intense for everybody. I'm going to also share this onto my Facebook feed. So give me about 1 second to make sure that I do it correctly. And just like always, right now, again, as I said last time, we're dealing with obviously a difficult time in wider Jewish history when there's still 100 plus of our brothers and sisters in captivity. And so just like Jews have been doing for thousands of years, we are really learning and studying on behalf of the eventual redemption and the freedom of any Jew who is currently still in captivity in Gaza. So I want our kavana, our intentionality, to be geared towards that. So I'll do a brief 2-minute quick review for either any newcomers that are here that didn't get a chance to watch the first class, or for people that just need a little bit of a refresher after a week of not thinking of these great medieval debates. And the review, both in terms of the historical account and also just in terms of two of the philosophers that we met last week, is that in the medieval period in Spain, and I'm talking the 11th, 12th, and eventually the 13th century, this was an era, and this was a historical episode of increasing cosmopolitanism within the wider Spain. This is at a time of increasing philosophic diversity. This is at a time in Islamic-controlled Spain when the great works of the Greek thinkers were eventually sort of metaphorically dug out from the troughs that they have been hiding for about 1,000 years. They were translated into Arabic, and all of a sudden, the talk of the town was Aristotle and Aristotelian philosophy. And all of a sudden, you have these intense moments within Jewish history. We can also, and another day, we can also talk about Islamic history went through very similar situations. Eventually, the Christian world got to very similar historical debates, but specifically from the Jewish perspective, this was at a time, and perhaps the first time in Jewish history, where there was a need to actually defend Jewish faith and belief from external philosophic arguments. And this is not something that Judaism really had to tackle beforehand, because in the times of the Talmud or the times of the Tanakh, generally, when Jews were engulfed within a wider culture, that culture wanted very little, if not nothing, to do with Judaism. And so you had, if you imagine what life was like for Jews in, say, the Galilee in the 2nd century CE during the time of the writing of the Mishnah, you would have Jewish villages, and then you'd have Roman villages, and maybe they would interact with each other in terms of trade, and maybe, you know, you happen to know somebody who might not have been Jewish, but you would not have had a situation where you have people from different faiths and different backgrounds all going to the same, say, bathhouse or the same center town square and actually engaging in conversation. And so all of a sudden, the Jewish community was faced with outside ideologies, which in turn forced a need for trying to, quote unquote, defend Jewish faith. And so last week, we met two of the big thinkers, and we're going to continue with these two big thinkers today. On the one hand, we had a man named Judah Halevi. And Judah Halevi is known for many things. He was a great poet. He wrote a lot of poems that I think if we were to spend just an entire class on his poetry, we'd be able to fill easily the hour, and we'd still want more time. Judah Halevi also wrote a book called the Kuzari. And we spent a lot of time last week introducing the book, the Kuzari. So just a 20-second review of what Judah Halevi's philosophy is that Judah Halevi is often dubbed the anti-philosopher. And Judah Halevi's worldview and his worldview of Judaism is centered around this idea that if we believe that Judaism is true, right, true with a capital T, God spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai 3,500 years ago, and that tradition has subsequently been passed down generation to generation. My father heard it from his father, heard it from his father, all the way back. Then why do I need any outside truth sources to try to reconcile my faith. Right? This is an epistemology that suggests if I already have the truth, what do I need outside truth sources, right? So if philosophy or if science or if the humanities is trying to teach me that perhaps, as Aristotle taught, and as everybody that was living in Spain in the 11th century would have been learning in their, whatever the equivalent of the public school system, Aristotle taught that the universe was eternal. And so that the universe was always here, right? If that contradicts Genesis, Judah Halevi says, well, there's no truth in philosophy because philosophy is an outside epistemology, right? Philosophers can't agree on anything anyway, and so reject that for the tradition because our internal tradition, by dint of it being passed down generation after generation, we know that's true. And so Jewish belief is certain, philosophic debate, and he would also say scientific realm is full of debate. And so if you have a tradition that you know is certain, and you compare that to a tradition that includes debate, you take the certainty, right? That's Judah Halevi's philosophy. We'll tease that more out today in terms of how it, what the practical ramifications are for mitzvot and Jewish tradition. On the other hand, we met a man who was born one generation later, Moses Maimonides. Like Judah Halevi, he was also a doctor. Like Judah Halevi, he also lived in Spain. Like Judah Halevi, he also was well steeped in both wider Islamic philosophy and culture and also Greek philosophy. And Moses Maimonides is going to have the exact opposite approach of Judah Halevi. Maimonides is going to suggest that, of course, philosophy, if done right, produces truths. Of course, science, if done right, produces truths. And so now you have a problem for Maimonides, because now you have two different things that are true. You have the world of philosophy that's true, and you have the world of Judaism that Maimonides believed is true. And so unlike Judah Halevi that suggests, okay, reject philosophy, Maimonides now is forced to engage with this dialectic between two truths that oftentimes contradict. And so Maimonides' work in the Guide to the Perplexed, which we introduced last week, ends up getting even more complicated because now Maimonides is forced to go through the entirety of the Torah and the entirety of the rabbinic tradition in the Talmud and reconcile that with the Greek philosophic tradition. And so if Aristotle teaches that God is a stoic figure that is not able to be depicted with any human emotion or human adjectives, right? That was a belief that all the philosophers would have accepted, that to say such a thing as God wants, or God gets angry, or God gets happy, right? That for Aristotle was nonsense because God is just the prime mover at the bottom of the universe. So what happens then when you get to synagogue on Shabbat morning and you decide that you're reading from a parsha throughout the book of Devarim or Deuteronomy, and all of a sudden the entire thing is full of, if you do this, God will be happy. If you do this, God will be mad, right? For Judah Halevi, that's easy, right? It's part of tradition, right? Of course, God gets angry because we have an unbroken tradition of God wanting certain things and God not wanting certain things. For Maimonides, the entire idea of God wanting and God not wanting and God's emotions, right, that falls apart. And so Maimonides is forced to engage in one of the most radical acts of reinterpretation possibly ever in Jewish history and attempt to decipher and understand the Torah from a Greek philosophic perspective. So we're going to continue with that a little bit today. Before we hop into some interesting sources and how both Maimonides and Judah Halevi approached the commandedness aspect of Judaism, or mitzvot, really the center of Jewish practice, I thought I'd take a 2-second break, see if anybody has any questions left over from last time, any thoughts, anything like that. We'll just take 1 or 2 minutes. And if not, we will hop right in. Perfect. Okay. So we have, just to share my screen here. Okay. So we're going to start with Maimonides here. Last week, we started with Judah Halevi, so I only felt that it's fair today to give Maimonides the first word. And so in thinking about what a mitzvah is And just to define some terms, Judaism has always been very action-centric. And hopefully everybody listening to this sort of can immediately think of hundreds of examples in their head. But starting off from the Torah, right? The Torah delineates a very specific system. The rabbis end up counting 613. But suffice it to say that Judaism is very action-centric in terms of the Torah, in terms of the Tanakh, certainly in terms of the Talmud. If one were to read the entirety of the entire Talmud is about 3,000 pages of Jews debating the ins and outs and minutia of a whole range of Jewish practice and Jewish mitzvot. So it becomes very clear to anybody that was in the Jewish community in the 11th century in Spain, just like I believe that it's clear for anybody in the Jewish community in 2023 America, that Judaism is a tradition that has ritual and action and works, to use a Christian term, right? Whereas Christianity was faith over works, Judaism is predominantly works over faith, right? What you do ends up in general being a lot more important than the specific faith, or so we thought, because Maimonides is going to end up challenging this idea that I would guess a lot of people here came in with that assumption. And to see this, we need to tackle one prior question. This is where things get a tiny bit confusing, so I will give that pre-warning, but we'll have a lot of time to unpack this. But in order to understand the view of Maimonides and Judah Halevi about mitzvot, we need to take one step back, and we need to tackle the question of, where did mitzvot come from? And so hopefully you're all sitting there at home saying, where did mitzvot come from? Mitzvot came from a prophetic act by either Moses or later Jewish thinkers, where God spoke to them and God said, thou shalt do X, thou shan't do Y, right? And that's where mitzvot came from. Okay, great. Let's say we all accept this idea that mitzvot comes from prophetic acts, right? It begs a much more fundamental question of, what is prophecy? And so this is going to end up being one of the big debates between Maimonides and Judah Halevi in terms of what prophecy is. What do we mean in Jewish tradition when we say that we have prophets, right? What did Moses do that was different than something that I do on a Tuesday morning? What did Isaiah or Jeremiah or Yechezkel or any of the great prophets do that any of us can't, right? Why listen to them as opposed to anybody here, right? Another way of asking this is, what's stopping a later Jewish thinker from just deciding that they are just as wise and learned as Moses and deciding that they're going to change the tradition? So Maimonides is going to give an answer that's very much in line with our class from last week. And just to remind everybody, Maimonides' view of Judaism is very philosophic centric. And so the goal of Judaism for Maimonides is going to be to try to perfect the way that human beings both think and act. But the very act of Judaism is, in some sense, a means to an end as opposed to an end in itself. And we'll touch on that a little bit later because it's a pretty radical view, which is why Maimonides' philosophy sparked a huge controversy within the Jewish community. I think next week we'll talk a little bit more about the sociology and history of these ideas. For today, we'll just focus on these ideas. But here is what Maimonides says. He gives us hints, and I'll say for a disclaimer at the beginning, the Guide to the Perplexed is probably the most difficult book in Jewish history to actually understand what Maimonides is talking about. One, because he writes like a philosopher, and if anybody here has ever tried to read a philosophy book cover to cover, there aren't a lot of things that are more difficult in terms of trying to understand the language. To make matters even worse, Maimonides, in his introduction to the Guide to the Perplexed, and here I am very much paraphrasing, but he says, the ideas that I'm describing are very dangerous and complicated. I'm not writing these ideas for the masses. I'm writing these ideas for the 1 out of 10,000 people that are able to comprehend the power of these ideas. Because these ideas are so complicated and so dangerous, I'm specifically going to fill my book with purposeful contradictions so that only the wisest of the wise can discern what I really mean when I say something is true. So Maimonides is telling us in his introduction that he is writing his magnum opus book of philosophy in a purposefully complicated way in order to specifically detract the average reader from being able to pick up his book and read cover to cover. So this, of course, ends up making sure that today in the study of Maimonides' thought, there is a whole range of scholarly opinion as to what exactly Maimonides believed on any topic. So I'm saying that as a disclaimer that I am now giving one approach, but there are certainly other ways to understand Maimonides' wider philosophy. But let's read a couple of sources of what Maimonides believed to be prophecy, and hopefully this will take us right into his view of commandments. So Maimonides writes in the Guide to the Perplexed, and he says, prophecy is, in truth and reality, an emanation sent forth by the divine being through the medium of the active intellect, in the first instance to man's rational faculty, and then to his imaginative faculty. It is the highest degree in perfection man can attain. It consists in the most perfect development of the imaginative faculty. So Maimonides is saying something quite radical here. And just to attempt to unpack what Maimonides is talking about, one could imagine a view of prophecy where it's almost the simplistic biblical view of prophecy, where one day Ethan is sitting there in his living room, and for whatever reason, God has a specific mission that only Ethan can carry out. And so all of a sudden, Ethan hears a booming voice from his living room and says, Ethan, I have a mission for you to carry out, right? Please go to, I don't know, Los Angeles, and I have this message for you to deliver. And for some perspective, if you view Tanakh stories, right, the stories of the Bible in a simplistic way, right, that's exactly what happens in terms of the story of, say, Jonah, right? Jonah happens to be some random guy. We're not really told why Jonah is important. And all of a sudden, God pops into Jonah's living room and says, go to the city of Nineveh. I have a very important mission to carry out. So Maimonides is going to completely reject that view, because for Maimonides, there was no such thing as a God who talks to people, right? That idea was nonsense. So if I were to tell you that God is talking to Ethan or God spoke with Jonah, Maimonides said, well, I'm already making the great error of Maimonides' thought, which is you can never describe God, because the second you describe God, you make God human. And so anytime you say God spoke or God wants or God commanded, right, you're already out. And so, right, you can slowly see why this is going to be a big issue for Maimonides explaining the commandments, because if he doesn't believe you can say God commanded, how do you say we have commandments? But we'll get to that in about 7 or 8 minutes. But Maimonides is going to suggest a completely different view of prophecy that's going to really radicalize Jewish philosophy really from Maimonides on. There's a little bit of this in Saadia Gaon. Just to give him his proper dues, he was an earlier Babylonian philosopher about 100 years before Maimonides. That was in Iraq, but just to give him a shout out there. But Maimonides is going to develop a philosophy in line with Aristotle that suggests as follows. God is the prime mover. And so God is the one who was the first causal chain to create the universe. And so if you imagine, right, this is Maimonides' argument from last week, the very fact that the universe is in motion and the very fact that something exists rather than nothing means for Maimonides that there had to have been an original cause, right? Things don't just start moving without any original force. And what happens when you keep going down the ladder of this force caused this force, caused this force, caused this force? Well, eventually you have to hit a original force or a prime mover, and that for Maimonides is God. Right? But that God, as I keep saying, that is not the type of God who you pray for when you need somebody to get better from an illness. That's not the type of God who you have to specify your diet and only eat kosher to serve. And so what Maimonides is going to suggest, in line with Neoplatonic thought, is that at the beginning of creation, God didn't just start the prime mover, but that there was an overflow of intellect from that prime mover that then was ubiquitous within the universe. And so the universe is teeming with intellectual truth, which for Maimonides ended up being any avenue that you can find truth, philosophy, the arts, the sciences, religion, all of that is already built in within the structure of the universe, right? You can see why Maimonides is oftentimes deemed maybe even a pantheist to some extent. Because what Maimonides is saying is, if you believe that the universe was created with a prime mover, and that prime mover built in the universe with all of its laws, both understandable and perhaps non-understandable to the average human mind, right? Then you could understand why, if I devote my life to philosophy or to science or to arts, I can learn more about the universe than somebody who devotes their life to, say, sitting around watching TV all day. And me, as somebody who's actively learning about the universe, by definition, I am actually becoming closer to God because the universe bears the imprint of divine law and divine plans for the universe. And so Maimonides' view of prophecy is going to be a hyper-rationalistic view of prophecy, where prophecy all of a sudden is not Ethan sitting in his living room, and maybe Ethan is a smart man, maybe Ethan is a dull man, maybe Ethan is an extremely moral citizen, maybe Ethan is one of the worst people you've ever met, right? From the traditional view of prophecy, it seems like that doesn't matter. God shows up into Ethan's living room saying, Ethan, I have a mission. Maimonides is going to say otherwise. Maimonides is going to say prophecy is what happens when a person that has the patience and the time and perhaps the natural disposition to learning philosophy, to heightening their moral thought process about the world, and to perfecting their imagination, right? So this requires, again, much more of a cosmopolitan view of the world, because now not only if I want to get prophecy, if I want to be a prophet, according to Maimonides, I can't just lock myself in my room all day and study Talmud. I actually have to go out and I have to learn the sciences. I have to learn the arts. I have to perfect myself ethically. And this requires truth sources that are outside of Judaism. And so Maimonides has a rationalistic view of prophecy, where prophecy is not a binary in terms of you're either a full prophet or nothing like all of us, but prophecy actually becomes a spectrum of the human ability to know things about the universe. And it turns out, if you spend a lot of time studying the universe, well, you become a better truth source about the universe, right? It's almost tautological. It's almost obvious in some sense in terms of trying to understand this from the rationalistic perspective. And so for Maimonides, prophecy is going to be a very naturalistic effect of what happens when you have somebody who is very wise, somebody who is very moral, and somebody who has perfected their imaginative faculty. So Maimonides then goes on a little bit, and I'll read this next argument, and then we'll take some time to unpack this together, because here I'm hoping I haven't lost people yet. But this is going to directly flow into Maimonides' view of commandment. So I'll read this, and then I'll even unshare my screen so we can have a little bit of a conversation as to how this directly flows. Maimonides continues in the guide and writes as follows: the reason of a commandment. So I want to stop myself there, and I'm gonna bold that line, because now for Maimonides, right, he's now forced with the next question. And Maimonides' next question is going to be as follows: if you believe, right, follow the argument for a second. If we believe that prophecy is God choosing somebody at random and making them a prophet, and then God happens to also tell that prophet, tell the Jewish people, thou shalt not mix meat and milk. If somebody were to say, well, why do we not eat meat and milk? The answer would be because God said so, right? Nothing needs to make sense rationally, because if it's a self-contained tradition, all of a sudden, I don't need to tell you why you shouldn't have a cheeseburger. You shouldn't have a cheeseburger because God, the foremost authority in the universe, has told you don't eat a cheeseburger. All of a sudden, for Maimonides, again, if prophets are chosen because of their heightened rationalistic intellect, and prophets are the ones through, of course, divine inspiration and prophecy, coming up with the laws of the Torah, such as Moses, well, then it follows that all of those commandments need rational reasons. And so one of Maimonides' other projects became a project to give what's called in medieval philosophy, tamei ha-mitzvot, or the reasons for the mitzvot. And so Maimonides, right, the reason why his Guide to the Perplexed is so long is because this is quite the project to undertake in terms of attempting to go through the 613 commandments, some of them seemingly nonsensical, and giving them rational reasons, right? It's a lot easier if you say, because God said so. But to read through Maimonides here, and then we'll unpack it a bit. So Maimonides says, the reasons of a commandment, whether positive or negative, is clear, and its usefulness evident if it is directly tends to remove injustice or to teach good conduct that furthers the well-being of society, or to impart a truth which ought to be believed either on its own merit or as being indispensable for facilitating the removal of injustice or the teaching of good morals. So Maimonides says there's one category of commandments that fit into this first category, and those are obvious, right? We all understand why. Hopefully you don't need to show up to a philosophy class to understand why you should not steal from your neighbor. So Maimonides is saying there's no occasion to ask for the object of such commandments, for nobody can be in doubt as to the reason of why we have been commanded to believe that there's one God, right? It's not great if you have a society where everybody thinks they're God, right? So there's one God, why we are forbidden to murder, to steal, to take vengeance, to retaliate, or why we are commanded to love one another, right? Hopefully we all understand these are inherently obvious in terms of why we do it. But he continues, there are precepts concerning which people are in doubt and of divided opinion, some believing that they are mere commands and serve no purpose whatsoever. So Maimonides is saying, there are other mitzvot or other Jewish commandments that it seems that there are some people that think there are no obvious reasons for them, while others believe that they serve a specific purpose which is unknown to man. Such are the precepts which in their literal meanings do not seem to further any of the three above named results, to impart truth, to teach morals, or to remove injustice. These other commandments do not seem to have any influence upon the well-being of the soul by imparting any truth, or upon the well-being of the body by suggesting such ways and rules as are useful in the government of the state or in the management of a household. So these are going to be the secondary categories. Such are the prohibitions of wearing garments containing wool and linen, a Jewish law called shatnez, of sowing diverse seeds, a Jewish law called kilayim, or of boiling meat and milk together, right? Cheeseburgers. The commandment of covering the blood of slaughtered beasts and birds, the ceremony of egla arufa, the breaking of the neck of a calf, in the case of a person found slain and the murder being unknown. If you don't recognize that, a fascinating case in the Torah about what happens if you find a dead body and you don't know where it originated from, the law concerning the firstborn of an ass and also any other animals and the like. So Maimonides is saying it seems like there is a secondary set of laws here that have no obvious reason, right? I can't give you, at least at face value, a rational explanation as to why you shouldn't eat a cheeseburger, right? It's very hard. But Maimonides says, I am prepared to tell you my explanation of all these commandments and to assign for them a true reason supported by proof, with the exception of a few minor rules and a few commandments, as I have mentioned above, right? We can package that aside. Eventually, if it's interesting, we can go back to what he means by this. I will show that all these and similar laws must have bearing upon one of the following three things: the regulation of our opinions, or the improvement of our social relations, which implies two things: the removal of injustice and the teaching of good morals. So Maimonides is saying as follows: you might think that some of the mitzvot and some of the commandments in our tradition are random. And you might say, well, the only reason why we don't eat cheeseburgers is because we have a tradition that God said so, right? That is the classical Jewish belief. But if you really think about it, and Maimonides spends a lot of time going commandment by commandment, trying to prove his point, you'll understand that really all of these in some way can fit in to one of these three things: regulating our opinion, removing injustice for our society, or teaching good morals. For instance, if somebody were to ask you, and this is what Maimonides does talk about, why should we not eat meat and milk, right? This is probably an easy one to come up with. Well, the act of cooking a child in something that the mother produces, right, literally boiling a calf in its mother's milk, seems like an immoral thing to do. And if every time you show up and want to select a dinner option, you have to remember, oh my goodness, we are not allowed to eat any meat and milk. Why are we not able to eat meat and milk? Oh, because that would be a cruel thing to do to animals. Then as you go about your day eating a kosher diet, it's not about the diet you're eating, right? There's nothing special about the fact that you opted for the vegan cheese on your burger as opposed to real cheese on your burger. But for Maimonides, this added up to a reminder that you are a part of a tradition that is teaching us to be more ethical going throughout your day. And by not eating a cheeseburger, it's not that there's anything special, again, about not eating a cheeseburger, but it's that this is just another time for the day, that it is a reminder that we're supposed to be utmost and moral, right? And he can go through all of the different commandments in a similar vein, going through them one by one, trying to say, you might think commandment X is random and serves no purpose. But if you think about it a little deeper, here is how it makes sense. So I'm going to unshare my screen for 1 second. I'll say one more thing about Maimonides' view, and then we can take some time for any thoughts and questions. And I'll do maybe one more interesting practical ramification of Maimonides' views, which is as follows. For Maimonides, if Judaism is all about philosophy, right? And what I mean by that is Judaism is a vehicle for finding truth, not the truth in and of itself, then the mitzvot, the commandments, have to follow, right? Maimonides takes the commandments and says, perhaps the important thing in terms of mitzvot might not be the actual mitzvah in itself, right? If I were to put on tefillin every morning, or if I were to shake a lulav every Sukkot, or if I were to make sure to never eat cheeseburgers, and that's all I'm doing, I'm missing the point. Because if you don't understand how these mitzvot are actually there in order to change the way that you think in terms of your ethics, you think in terms of your wider intellectual view of the world, and can actually then change society in some way, well, then all you're doing is waking up in the morning and wrapping some leather onto your arm. If you're not considering how the wrapping the leather onto your arm is connecting you with the oneness of God, and if you really understand that everything is all one, you're going to go out the world with a little bit more humility. Maybe you're going to treat people better. And so for Maimonides, mitzvot become a lot more about the reasons and even the intentions behind it. And so again, this might lead, we were talking a little bit last week. I totally forgot who said this last week, but we were talking about, well, what happens if somebody adopts a Jewish philosophy that suggests that only some of the mitzvot, right? I'm only going to practice some of the mitzvot, right? Maybe somebody celebrates Shabbat only every other week, right? Somebody decides, well, it's too hard to have a Shabbat every week. So every other week, I'm going to celebrate Shabbat. From a Maimonidean perspective, there's still a lot of value in it, because Shabbat is just a means to an end. And right, sure, Maimonides would say it's better, right, from a Maimonides perspective, it's obviously better to do Shabbat every week. And he would say you're doing something wrong by not doing Shabbat every week, but there still would be value in celebrating Shabbat whenever you can because of this wider philosophy. The last thing I'll say, and then this will be the last Maimonides thing I say, and we'll get some questions, then we'll go over to Judah Halevi. He has a famous parable to push back against this idea that Maimonides is espousing. Maimonides is actually very consistent with this view. And one of the most interesting ways in which Maimonides is consistent with this view surrounds Maimonides' view of sacrifice, right? Just a brief scaffold or a brief outline. For those that are familiar with the Torah is very sacrifice-centric, to the point where I can imagine if you are a regular synagogue goer, you have a little bit of an internal groan whenever we get to the book of Vayikra or Leviticus, because as opposed to the exciting stories of Bereshit and Shemot of Genesis and Exodus, we are seemingly stuck with laundry list after laundry list of animal sacrifices. And so Maimonides is forced to answer the question of, why do we do sacrifices? Because again, from a traditional perspective, we do sacrifices because God wants sacrifices, right? The Torah says God likes the smell of the aroma of sacrifices, right? Reach nichoach l'Adonai, right? For Maimonides, there is no God who smells sacrifices, right? Again, that's nonsense. So Maimonides ends up coming up with a long essay. This is one of his most famous or infamous opinions, that the reason why, and I'll actually share my screen here. I was going to summarize this, but I have the source here. So just to right here, Maimonides says as follows in terms of sacrifices. It is impossible to go from one extreme to the other suddenly. Therefore, man, according to his nature, is not capable of suddenly abandoning that to which he was deeply accustomed. As it was then, the deeply ingrained and universal practice with which people were brought up to conduct religious worship with animal sacrifices in temples. God, in his wisdom, did not see fit to command us to completely reject all these practices, something that man could not conceive of accepting according to human nature, which inclines it to habit. It would have been comparable to a prophet appearing today, calling for the service of God, declaring that God now commands you not to pray, not to fast, not to seek him in times of distress, but your service of him should be in meditation without any deeds whatsoever. He therefore allowed these practices to continue, but transformed them from idolatrous associations that their purpose be directed towards him. Thus he commanded us to build a sanctuary for him with an altar to his name and offer sacrifices to him. The reason why the Torah talks so much about sacrifices and about a temple for Maimonides is not because the ideal way to practice Judaism is with animal sacrifices in a temple. It's that the generation of Israelites that received the Torah from Moses were steeped in normal religious practice at the time, which included temples, animal sacrifices, and I'll even add one, human sacrifices. And God understood, or really the way that Maimonides would think about it is that Moses, in his understanding of God, because again, that's part of Maimonides' philosophy, understood that if you show up one day and you tell the Israelites in the desert, no more temples, no more sacrifice, no more incense, no more priests, all of a sudden now people are going from one extreme to the other, and they would not be able to comprehend that. And Maimonides says, it is as if somebody came with us today and told us, no more mitzvot, no more Jewish holidays, no more rabbis, everybody just go out into a field and meditate, and that's where you find truth. Now, interestingly enough, Maimonides is giving us hints that that may be how he conceives of the ideal religious person. Because again, for Maimonides, sacrifices, the temple, and even mitzvot in some sense become instrumental. And so for Maimonides, even sacrifices, even a temple, even a lot of the holidays that we have are not thought of as important in and of themselves. They're only important in terms of them serving a wider purpose. Okay, we'll pause there. Would love to hear some thoughts, questions. We have, I think, 24 people here, so we must have at least 40 different opinions on what we just read. Would love to hear some thoughts. Yeah, go for it, Rhea.
So from what the description of Maimonides' thinking, that God is a social worker and looks at a community and the functioning of a community, but also during the rabbinic period, that's exactly what they were doing, is looking, is this true, that looking at the community as whole and its functioning, like in our Declaration of Independence and the formation of our country, it's a community-centered look and how can the community function. And that the idea that we need to have what's in the past to overlay it so that it becomes more palatable, the new form. That it undermines the idea that we have the brain to be able to rationalize, to be able to think. And that is the concept that God has provided us with a brain, and that we are able to reason and figure out. It isn't this sudden voice from God, but because we have this brain that we're able to do this.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes 100% sense. And I'll even add to what you're saying. It's that it's both the fact that we have a brain and also the fact that the universe, by its very imprint of God having created it, is teeming with truth, right? And so it's up to us to actually go tap into that. And the same way that if I and if Albert Einstein were both trying to observe how gravity works, Albert Einstein's going to have a much more deeper understanding of truth, even though gravity affects me and Albert Einstein equally. And so there's no fundamental difference between Albert Einstein and non-Albert Einstein in understanding the universe. It's not that it's random that Albert Einstein's the one to reevaluate how we see gravity. It's that Albert Einstein internally, by learning the tools to understanding the universe, ends up being a better understander of the universe, right? And this is also, right, just one more way to phrase this, right? This also gets into Maimonides' view of why Abraham, right? From the Torah's perspective, it seems that Abraham was chosen quite randomly, right? All of a sudden, God comes to Abraham in Genesis 12 and says, leave your father's house, and go to the land I'll show you, right? Of course, we're all probably familiar with the Midrash and the Talmud of painting this interesting backstory of Abraham smashing the idols. But Maimonides takes this one step further and says that the voice of God saying go was always there throughout all time. And Abraham was the only one who, right, if you think about this in radio frequency analogy, right, the stream was always there. Abraham was the first person in history to have his dial tuned to the exact right settings in order to understand that God was calling out, right? And so again, there's nothing inherent about Abraham that made God call out to him. It's irrelevant, right? It's nonsensical to even say that God called out to Abraham. Abraham was the one who ended up being able to heed this call that was around for all humans. Rosalie, go for it.
Can you put up the last thing that you had, the reading, the very last? I think I have a question. I'm not sure.
Go for it.
Okay, I can't find it in this one. It's not okay. Therefore, man, according to his nature, is not capable of suddenly abandoning that to which he was deeply accustomed. I don't remember what my question was now, but it sounds like it's a pejorative.
No, I don't think it's pejorative. I think he's being a realist in terms of social psychology, in terms of, right, him saying that if we were to try to think of a good other example. I mean, he's consistent in this view with a lot of things, right? Here's another controversial one to throw out there. A lot of scholars of Judaism ask a pretty obvious question of why it seems that the Tanakh and the Talmud enshrine slavery, right? This was actually a major debate, right? Just a very interesting historic tidbit. During the Civil War, there were rabbis that were both in the North and the South, right? The Union and the Confederacy. And there was actually a series of debates between rabbis in the North and the South about whether or not Judaism is pro or anti-slavery, right? So just to, as a jumping off point, the anti-slavery position quotes Maimonides and says that just because the Torah and the Talmud talk about the institution of slavery and actually create a legal system that involves slavery, it doesn't mean the Torah is pro-slavery. It meant that the Torah understood the reality of a society that revolves around slavery. You can't, right? And whether or not you agree with this view, let's put that aside. But from the Torah's perspective, right, what the rabbi in the North argued is God and Moses understood that if God were to say on day one, thou shalt free all your slaves, that nobody would listen and that the whole project would be thrown out. And so what does the Torah do? the Torah, and then even more so in the Talmud, attempts to create more and more constraints around slaves. So the Torah says, now you're not allowed to hurt your slave. After 7 years, right, if it's a Jewish slave, you have to release your slave. The Talmud says if you only have one pillow, you need to give that pillow to your slave, right? If you're going to have dinner, the slave needs to eat first. And so, right, through that perspective of, right, revolutions in society to some extent, Maimonides was not a revolutionary, because he did not think you could, between today and tomorrow, change the mechanics of how society functions. And so that Judaism plants the seeds so that over the course of generations and generations, that's where slow change happens. I am noticing the time, and I really want to get to Judah Halevi here. We only have about 15 minutes left. And so we'll have time for conversation. I'm happy to stay a little bit extra and chat, but I do know some people have a strict 10:30 deadline. So by now, hopefully, we've understood a little bit of Maimonides' perspective. We can understand a little bit as to how radical it is really in its reevaluation of Jewish ideas. Judah Halevi is going to, of course, defend the traditional account. And his defense of the traditional account is both very interesting, very vivid, and also it's going to be important for understanding the trickle-down effects, right? Next week, we will talk about a lot of the trickle-down effects of both Maimonides and Judah Halevi's view. And I said this last week, Judah Halevi is in some way the intellectual predecessor to Kabbalah or to Jewish mysticism. And hopefully soon we will be able to see why. So here is what Judah Halevi writes about prophecy, and note the stunning difference and opposition to Maimonides. These conditions which render man fit to receive this divine influence or prophecy do not lie within him. So, right, he's starting out, right, exact opposite with Maimonides. For Maimonides, prophecy was an internal thing. For Judah Halevi, right, there's nothing internal about it. It is impossible for him to gauge their quantity or quality, and even if their essence was known, yet neither their time, place, or connection nor suitability could be discovered. For this, inspired and detailed instruction is necessary, right? So he's saying straight up, there is nothing one could do to increase their chances of becoming a prophet, right? Not in terms of increasing your intellect, not in terms of going to a specific place, not in terms of going to a specific time, right? There's nothing internal about this, right? He who has been thus inspired and obeys the teaching in every respect with a pure mind is a believer, right? Somebody who listens to a prophet, right? That person is considered a believer. Whoever strives by speculation and deduction to prepare the conditions for the reception of this inspiration, or by divining, as is found in the writings of astrologers trying to call down supernatural beings or manufacturing talismans, such a man is an unbeliever. So if you think that, hey, this prophecy thing sounds really cool, I'm going to, a la Maimonides, start learning physics and start learning the arts and start perfecting myself so I might be a prophet. Judah Halevi says, you are an unbeliever, right? You are not part of this Jewish tradition, right? You are rejecting some component, right? He says the same thing about people who try to use astrology or other types of magic in order to receive prophecy, right? This person may bring offerings and burn incense in the name of speculation and conjecture, while he is in reality ignorant of that which he should do, how much, in what way, by what means, in what place, by whom, in what manner, and many other details, the enumeration of which would lead too far, right? And here is his famous analogy. We'll do this analogy. This will be the last text we do for today, and then we will unpack it. I love this analogy. He says, if you try to think, I can decipher the truth of our tradition with external modalities, that person is like an ignoramus, right? An idiot who enters the surgery of a physician famous for their curative powers of their medicine, right? So you enter into a doctor's office from a well-known doctor in Southern California because you have some illness. The physician is not at home, but you know that people come for the medicine. The fool dispenses them out of the jars, knowing nothing of the contents, nor how much should be given to each person. Thus he kills with the very medicine which should have cured them. Should he by chance have effected a cure with one of the drugs, the people will turn to him and say that he helped them, till they discover that he deceived them or they seek other advice and cling to this without noticing that the real cure was affected by the skill of the learned physician who prepares the medicines and explained to them the proper manner in which they were to be administered. He also taught the patients what food and drink, exercise and rest was necessary, likewise what air was the best, and at what place of repose. Like unto the patients duped by the ignoramus, so were the men with few exception before the times of Moses. They were deceived by astrological and physical rules, wandering from law to law, from God to God, or adopted a plurality at the same time. They forgot their guide and master and regarded their false gods as helping causes, while they are in reality damaging causes according to their construction and arrangements. Profitable on its own account is the divine influence, hurtful on its own account, the absence thereof. So a famous analogy of Judah Halevi saying the mitzvot, or the commandments, or the tradition, are akin to medicine, right? And we all know that medicine only works, or generally works, only if it is given in the proper dosage at the proper time for the proper illness, right? No matter how good the medical field is, it's not going to help if I show up to a pharmacy with no knowledge, open up a bunch of bottles, and eat a bunch of pills. And so what Judah Halevi is saying is the medicine is the mitzvot, is the commandments. And only if we have a tradition that's passed down from one generation to the next that prescribes the exact type of ritual, the exact times for rituals, and the exact dosage for every ritual, right? We read the Talmud, and the Talmud says exactly what the hours are every morning that you are allowed to say the Shema. It has to be after sunrise. It has to be before noon. You have to be doing it in a certain area. You have to be covering your eyes in a certain way. You have to be facing east, right? All of these prescriptions are just like a doctor saying, don't take this on an empty stomach, right? Make sure you drink a lot of water after this. Only take this twice a day, not 3 times a day, right? And if somebody were to say, right, through their own hubris, well, I know that the Talmud says you're supposed to start Shabbat every week at sundown. But that's just because the Talmud wants you to rest. So maybe this week, I'll just rest on Tuesday instead of Saturday. Judah Halevi says that person is like an average person walking into a doctor's office eating pills, because without the prophetic inspiration, which only comes external, we are all the ignoramuses in this equation. And so Judah Halevi's view of mitzvot is going to be that of a lot more internal prescription, right? No pun intended. But the mitzvot, or the commandments, are exactly prescribed to be exactly what they need to be, and they are inherently truthful, right? So as opposed to Maimonides, who's going to suggest that no, actually, anybody can and should try to figure out all of the details of all of the different medicines and dosages, and there's a whole spectrum from the physician to the ignoramus. Judah Halevi says, nope, there are physicians and there are ignoramuses. And the physicians, just like the prophets, are qualitatively different, right? There's a qualitative difference to a prophet, whereas Maimonides only believed there was quantitative difference for a prophet. A prophet was just somebody who was like us that knew more. For Judah Halevi, we can't even understand what it's like to receive prophecy because we've never described it. And so therefore, whereas Maimonides' intention and the ideas and the reasons and the philosophy of the mitzvot becomes the central focus of them, right? Why are you doing it? What help does it do to either you, society, your worldview, right? That's what Maimonides is focused on. For Judah Halevi, he's able to defend a traditional account of mitzvot and rituals through this famous analogy of simply saying, we are not in the position and ability to try to understand all of the different reasons and rationalizations. The only thing that we can do that would be smart is to accept the fact that we do not have the authority to understand this. And just like me with zero medical knowledge would be hesitant to show up to a doctor's office, disobey them, and start taking random pills, we also, as Jews, should be very hesitant to start going to our tradition and tinkering around with it because we don't understand all of the truth claims behind it. So again, two different thinkers, completely different views of how prophecy functions. I'll open it up for some thoughts and questions. I see Rhea writes, if the rules come from the Talmudic rabbis, why do the rabbis also give the minority opinions? It is a great question. And Judah Halevi, right, both of these worldviews of Judaism, I'll just say in answering your question, I'll just open up a whole other just line of analysis here. What both Judah Halevi and Maimonides is doing is trying to create an internal defense of Judaism in some way. So both of their projects, the Kuzari and the Guide to the Perplexed, would have been completely non-understandable to the rabbis of the Talmud. They were engaged in a completely different project in terms of what they were doing, right? Judah Halevi and Maimonides are both trying to defend Judaism from outside attacks. Maimonides tries to defend it by synthesis. Judah Halevi tries to defend it by rejection. And so they both have a lot of internal questions from tradition that can challenge their entire modality of thinking. And Rhea pointed out the biggest, I would say, internal critique of Judah Halevi's view, which is, if it really is true, we have this unbroken tradition of truth, one generation to the last, why do we have any disagreement at all? What Judah Halevi would say, and I believe he writes about this in the Kuzari, though this might just be commentators on the Kuzari, so somebody's welcome to fact check me, is that there was an initial capital T truth tradition, and over time, because of exile and diaspora, some of the more minute claims were lost. And so not the fact that Shabbat is important, right? Everybody knew that. Not the fact that you don't, light fires on Shabbat, that everybody knows that. But what happens if your ox ends up brushing against a fence, which ends up causing a spark, which ends up lighting a fire? Do you have to bring a sacrifice to apologize for the fact that you lit a fire on Shabbat? Okay, maybe that you're going to end up having debates on, because that's such a minute matter that throughout the ages that gets lost. But the capital T underlined bold tradition, that's something that's going to have remained steadfast one generation to the next. But it is a great question, Rhea. Any other thoughts, questions, points of contention here? I'm curious to ask a generalized question. Where are people at in terms of are we Maimonides people or Judah Halevi people, or somewhere in between?
Somewhere in between, I think. And I think this is what you've done is so fascinating. We could do a whole like semester or 2 or 4 years just between the two, Maimonides and Judah Halevi, because they're both fascinating people and really hard to read. So thank you.
Yeah, of course. Well, this is a little bit of a sneak peek. I actually am doing a class at UCI in the spring on this exact topic. I mean, we're going to go a little bit deeper and more thorough. And so, yes, I am very excited for that. And hopefully I'll be able to come back. And once I finalize the syllabus, we'll have some more sources, because there are later thinkers that end up trying to bridge these two accounts and everything. I see some people have to go because it's 10:30. I am more than happy to hang around for another couple minutes. I see Dory wrote in the comments, definitely Maimonides. I'm curious if anybody else wants to take a vote. Ellen wrote just a question. God tells the prophets what to say and who they're to speak to, except for Jonah and the prophets question what God asked of them. Would they have agreed more with Maimonides or Judah? Ellen, I'm not sure if I understand the question.
Would the prophets have, if the prophets were questioning God and what he wanted them to tell, whether they agreed with what God wanted them to tell them or not? I mean, whether the prophets agreed with what God wanted to say to the different people. You're bad, you're not doing what I want you to do, you better do this or else. Would that have been more of a Maimonides viewpoint or a Judah Halevi viewpoint?
Probably a Maimonides viewpoint, only because Maimonides ends up actually making the more radical position elsewhere, that it's actually possible for prophets in some way to be wrong, right? So because prophecy ends up being a spectrum, right? Prophets are no longer perfect, right? As opposed to Judah Halevi, which if a prophet says something, that is ipso facto true. For Maimonides, there's already shades of truth when it comes to prophets. And if a prophet says something that is correct, right? It's true in some sense, but sometimes it's fully true, sometimes it's half true. So I think that's a really good question. Because again, for Maimonides, prophecy was not anything happening to you externally. It was all internal. So it would be the same way of, yes, if you were in a debate with Albert Einstein about gravity, you should probably listen to Albert Einstein, but none of us here are thinking that Albert Einstein was infallible if he was teaching a class on gravity, right? He was certainly open to being wrong. Maimonides would view prophets as very similar to that analogy of saying, yes, definitely listen to the prophets because out of everyone, they know the best, but they could be wrong. And there's nothing inherent about Albert Einstein that makes him right. If somebody else spends 50 years studying gravity and physics also, they can challenge they can challenge Albert Einstein, and perhaps they end up being right? Maimonides ends up having to force himself into a lot of corners because he is forced into explaining why Moses' prophecy was unique. And so Maimonides devotes a lot of his book, Guide to the Perplexed, to defending this idea that Moses as a prophet was at a qualitative difference level above everybody else, but Moses still ends up being a philosopher. So just like Plato's vision of the philosopher king, Moses is the Jewish philosopher king who, right, set up all this law and everything like that. So, but again, you can already see how Maimonides is forced to rationalize with a lot in our tradition and end up changing it in a lot of ways. Rhea, go for it.
Okay, so just short thing that the prophets did not prophesize future. They were social critics and warned that if you don't do X, Y, and Z, you're in for a terrible future. But it's not like saying on Thursday there's going to be an earthquake, and then everybody believes that there's going to be an earthquake on Thursday. Am I right? So it's and I don't know where the word prophet comes from. What Hebrew word is used, and what are the various meanings?
The Hebrew word is a navi or a nevuah.
So isn't that somebody who's dedicated?
Yes, it depends. I mean, really, it just means somebody who calls out, or somebody who.
Right. So it's not a predictor. That's not in the meaning of it.
Yes. Usually we have this view of prophecy that it is somebody making a prediction about the future. Generally, the biblical prophets, I mean, they spoke generally, right? This actually is a score from Maimonides, because Isaiah is not saying, on December 12th, right, invest in this stock. He's saying, you are treating people terribly. If you keep doing this, God is going to come destroy you because you're worse than Sodom, right? So yes, right. In a lot of ways, he is just a more astute social commentator than he is predictor of the future. So you're
so Maimonides' concept of us having this brain, which is capable of all kinds of stuff that we can do with it, that it isn't necessarily God coming and saying, you'd say this to the people. It's that person's ability to utilize the brain and thinking about the social fabric of the world or whatever. And so that it isn't as simple, the word comes in from an external source. Am I right?
Yes, you're 100% right. You got it.
Okay.
Perfect. Well, thank you all so much. I'm excited to see you all next Monday. We'll talk a lot about the downstream effects here. So we'll move on formally from Maimonides and Judah Halevi, but I'm very excited and wishing you all an early happy Hanukkah that starts in 3.5 days from now. So I will see you all next week.
Thank you so